In December of 1944, when American soldiers of the 106th Infantry Division were captured during the Battle of the Bulge, they witnessed something that disturbed them more deeply than their capture itself. Their German captors devoured a dense black bread with an almost animal intensity, chewing the dark substance as if each piece was precious fuel for a desperate war machine. Lieutenant Robert Hayes wrote in his clandestine diary, "They eat that black bread like hungry wolves, and there is something in their eyes when they do it, a hardness that goes beyond normal hunger." What Hayes was observing was Kommissbrot, the infamous German black bread that had transformed from a simple military ration into something far more sinister. The acrid, penetrating aroma emanating from those compact pieces of dark dough carried more than just the smell of fermented grains. It carried the odor of desperation of a regime that had discovered how to turn hunger into fury. This was not just a problem of wartime rationing. It was evidence of a deliberate and calculated experiment that connected food deprivation with military aggression. The following investigation will reveal how the Nazis discovered that hungry soldiers, fed brutal substitutes, became more effective instruments of violence. It will also show why the Allies began to fear not only German weapons, but the very hunger that fueled them. The transformation of Kommissbrot from a respectable military food to an instrument of psychological conditioning began in 1941. At that time, the German High Command faced a brutal reality. The war would not be quick as Hitler had promised. With the invasion of the Soviet Union extending into winter and food resources being prioritized for the German civilian population to maintain domestic morale, the military was forced to seek creative alternatives to feed an army of millions. Dr. Ernst Ziegler, a military nutritionist assigned by the Ministry of War, received a seemingly simple order: keep soldiers fed with anything available. But Ziegler, influenced by Nazi racial theories about German resistance and superiority, saw an opportunity for something more ambitious. In reports declassified decades later, it was discovered that Ziegler had deliberately proposed a hardening diet. This was a combination of controlled deprivation and food substitutes that, according to his theory, would strengthen German military determination. The Kommissbrot recipe was systematically altered. Wood sawdust, ground tree bark, beet pulp, and even processed cellulose began to replace increasing portions of real flour. Officially, this was presented as war economy measures. However, internal documents reveal a darker agenda: to create a condition of controlled hunger that kept soldiers in a constant state of aggression, where violence became an outlet for physical and psychological frustration. The first large-scale test of this new formula occurred with the 6th German Mountain Division, stationed in Norway during the winter of 1942. Soldiers received exclusively the reformulated Kommissbrot for 3 months, supplemented only with small portions of canned meat and preserved vegetables. The results, documented in military reports that remained classified until the 1970s, were simultaneously alarming and, for Nazi commanders, encouraging. Corporal Heinrich Müller of the 2nd Company wrote in an intercepted letter, "The bread tastes like rotten wood, but after a few weeks you stop noticing. What you do notice is the constant rage in your stomach, as if something is always gnawing inside. The officers say this makes us stronger, more determined. Maybe they are right. Yesterday I broke a Russian prisoner's arm just because he looked at me the wrong way." The division's medical reports showed a disturbing pattern. While soldiers lost weight and showed signs of mild malnutrition, their levels of aggression in combat increased dramatically. Incidents of violence against prisoners tripled, and the willingness to execute brutal orders without question reached levels that impressed even SS commanders. Dr. Ziegler had discovered something the Nazis considered a secret weapon: controlled hunger as a catalyst for military brutality. The success of the Norwegian experiment led to the gradual implementation of the new Kommissbrot formula in all German divisions. This started with elite Waffen-SS units and expanded to the regular Wehrmacht. In March of 1943, as German forces faced increasing pressure on the Eastern Front, the distribution of the reformulated Kommissbrot reached its peak of sinister efficiency. German soldiers were daily consuming between 600 to 800 grams of a substance that contained only 40% of ingredients traditionally considered food. The remainder was a carefully calibrated mixture of vegetable fibers, chemically treated sawdust for partial digestibility, and additives that created a temporary feeling of satiety without providing real nutrition. Sergeant Klaus Weber, a veteran of the Russian campaign, described in his diary the transformation he observed in himself and in his men. After 2 months with the black bread, you wake up hungry and go to sleep hungry, but it is not a normal hunger. It is like there is a black hole inside you that can never be filled. And this hunger, it makes you furious with everything. With the Russians, with the officers, with the whole world. When you finally encounter the enemy, all this rage explodes. The psychological effects were exactly what Nazi planners had anticipated. Soldiers in a state of chronic hunger developed a survival mentality that made them more willing to extreme acts of violence, especially when these acts could result in access to better food. Allied intelligence reports began to document a pattern. German units fed exclusively with Kommissbrot showed significantly higher levels of brutality against civilians and prisoners, particularly in situations where additional food was available as a reward for violent actions. The strategy had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Hungry soldiers fought with more ferocity, not for ideology, but for basic biological necessity. The first documented encounter between Allied soldiers and the black bread phenomenon occurred in September of 1943. British forces captured a German position in Italy. Captain James Morrison of the 2nd Rifle Battalion reported a disturbing discovery in the German bunkers. We found piles of this black bread that looked like coal. When we tried to eat a piece, it was like chewing damp wood. But what shocked us was the reaction of the German prisoners when they saw we had found their rations. They were genuinely desperate, begging us not to destroy the bread. What Morrison did not understand was that he was observing the effects of a carefully cultivated psychological dependence. German soldiers were not just physically dependent on Kommissbrot as a source of calories. They had been conditioned to associate their military identity and fighting ability with the consumption of this specific substance. Removing the black bread was not just depriving them of food. It was breaking a psychological cycle that connected hunger, rage, and military effectiveness. Interrogation reports revealed a consistent pattern. Captured German soldiers frequently refused to eat normal Allied rations in the first days of captivity, not out of distrust, but because real food made them feel weak and less alert. They had been conditioned to interpret constant hunger as a normal and necessary state for military performance. Prisoner after prisoner described the same sensation. Without the constant gnawing hunger, they felt disarmed and vulnerable. This discovery deeply alarmed Allied commanders, who began to realize they were not just facing a well-trained army, but soldiers who had been systematically conditioned through food deprivation. Scientific analysis of captured Kommissbrot revealed a composition that defied any conventional definition of military food. British and American laboratories discovered that the substance contained only 1,200 calories per kilogram, significantly less than standard military rations. However, it included chemical additives that stimulated cortisol and adrenaline production. Dr. Margaret Thornton, a British military nutritionist, described her analysis. It is not just bad bread. It is a drug disguised as food. The Germans had discovered that certain nutritional deficiencies, when combined with specific additives, created a state of hypervigilance and aggression that lasted hours after consumption. Soldiers fed Kommissbrot showed elevated stress hormone levels for prolonged periods, keeping them in an almost constant fight-or-flight state. This condition made them extraordinarily effective in short-duration combat, but also predisposed them to extreme acts of violence when confronted with additional stress. Tests conducted on voluntary German prisoners confirmed the effects. After 1 week consuming only Kommissbrot, individuals showed a 300% increase in aggressive behaviors during simulated exercises compared to those fed standard Allied rations. More disturbing still, they demonstrated a significant reduction in empathy and moral judgment, especially in situations involving competition for resources. The Allies had discovered they were fighting an army that had been systematically transformed into a force of hungry predators, conditioned to see violence as the most direct path to survival. In October of 1943, the Allied High Command issued a classified directive known as Operation Breadbasket. This was a counterintelligence program specifically designed to combat the effects of German food conditioning. The strategy was simultaneously simple and revolutionary: capture as many German soldiers alive as possible and subject them to a nutritional rehabilitation program that would break their psychological dependence on the state of hunger. General George Patton, initially skeptical about the importance of the food issue, changed his mind after personally observing German prisoners during the program. In a letter to General Eisenhower, he wrote, "These Germans come to us like wild animals, willing to bite anyone who approaches. After 2 weeks of decent food, they become human again. It is the most disturbing thing I have ever seen. They literally did not know they were being poisoned by their own food." The program revealed the full extent of Nazi conditioning. German soldiers in nutritional recovery frequently experienced what military psychologists described as reality shock. This was a period of deep depression when they realized the extent of the manipulation they had been subjected to. Many reported that, for the first time in years, they could think clearly about their actions during the war, and the resulting guilt was devastating. Corporal Friedrich Schmidt, captured in Anzio, described his experience. "When the constant hunger finally stopped, it was like waking from a nightmare. I remembered things I had done, people I had hurt, and I could not understand how I had been capable of it. It was as if someone else had been in control of my body." The discovery of the effects of Kommissbrot led to a fundamental change in Allied military strategy. Commanders began to prioritize the capture of German supply depots, not only to deny resources to the enemy, but to break the conditioning cycle that kept the Nazi war machine running. Special operations were developed specifically to contaminate or destroy Kommissbrot stocks, forcing German units to rely on improvised rations that did not contain the psychological additives. Major William Hayes, commander of a sabotage unit, reported the results. "When we managed to destroy a German division's black bread supplies, we saw a dramatic change in their combat behavior within 72 hours. They still fought, but without that animal ferocity that characterized them. It was as if we had removed a combat drug." The Germans responded with desperate measures to protect their food supplies. Kommissbrot depots received the same protection as ammunition arsenals, and German soldiers were instructed to destroy their rations before surrendering. This was to prevent the Allies from discovering more about the composition. This extreme prioritization of food supplies confirmed for Allied commanders that they had discovered a critical vulnerability in the Nazi war machine. Captured documents revealed that German commanders themselves were aware of the risks of their food strategy. Internal reports showed growing concern about the long-term sustainability of keeping soldiers in a state of controlled hunger, but short-term effectiveness was considered essential for the regime's survival. During the winter of 1944, as German forces faced pressure on all fronts, Kommissbrot production reached levels of desperation that shocked even its creators. With traditional ingredients completely exhausted, German factories began to incorporate materials that defied any definition of edible. These included chemically treated recycled paper, processed leather scraps, and even fibers from damaged military uniforms. Dr. Ernst Ziegler, the original architect of the formula, wrote in his personal diary, "We created a monster that now devours itself. Soldiers are literally eating the remains of their dead comrades, processed into bread. But they continue fighting with a ferocity that defies all human logic." The situation had become so extreme that German soldiers were consuming a substance that contained less than 20% of real nutritive material, sustained primarily by chemical additives and the very psychology of hunger. Allied field reports documented the result. German soldiers captured during this period showed signs of severe malnutrition, but maintained levels of aggression that surprised their captors. They had become literally hungry skeletons, animated by chemistry and psychological conditioning. Allied military doctors described prisoners who weighed 30% less than normal for their height, but who still tried to attack guards with surprising force. The Nazi war machine had transformed into a cannibalistic system that consumed its own soldiers to maintain the illusion of military strength. In February of 1945, as Allied forces advanced deep into German territory, they discovered disturbing evidence of the full extent of the Nazi food conditioning program. Kommissbrot factories were found operating until the last days of the war, producing substances that could barely be called food, but which continued to keep German soldiers in a state of desperate combat. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Anderson of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers led the investigation of one such factory near Munich. His report described an industrial operation dedicated to the production of weaponized hunger. We found machines designed specifically to process non-food materials into forms that could be consumed by human beings. There were entire laboratories dedicated to testing chemical combinations that would maximize aggression while minimizing real nutrition. It was a factory of zombie soldiers. The recovered documents revealed that the program had expanded beyond military forces. German civilian populations in strategic areas were also receiving modified versions of Kommissbrot, creating an entire society conditioned for fanatical resistance. German children as young as 12 years old were being fed substances that kept them in a state of hypervigilance, preparing them to become irregular combatants. The discovery explained why German resistance remained so fierce, even when defeat was obviously inevitable. It was not just Nazi ideology. It was an entire population that had been systematically conditioned through food to see violence as a natural response to any perceived threat. The long-term effects of Nazi food conditioning only became apparent after the war ended, when Allied military psychologists began studying German veterans in denazification programs. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, an American military psychiatrist, documented a disturbing pattern. Former German soldiers who had consumed Kommissbrot for prolonged periods showed permanent difficulties in regulating emotions and aggressive behavior. They had been conditioned to a neurological level, wrote Dr. Mitchell in her 1946 report. Even years after stopping consumption of the substance, their brains still responded to stress with the same patterns of extreme aggression that had been artificially induced during the war. It was as if we had discovered a way to permanently reprogram the human response to conflict. Follow-up studies revealed that children of German soldiers who had consumed Kommissbrot for long periods also showed elevated rates of aggressive behavior and emotional control difficulties. The substance had created epigenetic changes that were transmitted to the next generation, perpetuating the effects of Nazi conditioning decades after the war ended. Post-war German communities struggled with abnormally high rates of domestic violence and antisocial behavior. Researchers eventually connected these problems to the food conditioning program. Kommissbrot had left scars that extended far beyond the battlefield, affecting the German social structure for generations. In 1947, as the Nuremberg trials were coming to an end, Allied prosecutors considered including the food conditioning program as evidence of crimes against humanity. Declassified documents revealed that the Nazis had deliberately used hunger as a weapon, not only against occupied populations, but against their own soldiers and civilians, transforming them into instruments of violence through systematic nutritional manipulation. Dr. Ernst Ziegler, captured by the Allies, provided detailed testimony about the program during interrogations. He revealed that food conditioning had been considered so effective that plans were being developed to implement it in occupied populations after a German victory. This would create entire societies of workers conditioned for obedience through controlled hunger. We discovered that we could make anyone do anything if we controlled their food properly, testified Ziegler. We did not need concentration camps for the entire population. We just needed to control what they ate. Hunger makes people desperate, and desperate people are easily controlled. Ziegler's testimony revealed the full extent of the Nazi vision for post-war Europe, a continent of hungry and conditioned populations, kept in a state of submission through systematic food manipulation. Kommissbrot was not just a military ration. It was a prototype for total social control through nutritional deprivation. Although the program was never formally tried at Nuremberg due to the complexity of proving its effects, The documents were preserved as evidence of the depth of Nazi depravity. The discovery of the Nazi food conditioning program had profound impacts on the development of post-war military and food security policies. The Allies implemented rigorous protocols to monitor the composition of military rations, ensuring that never again could food be used as a tool for large-scale psychological conditioning. International human rights organizations included specific protections against food manipulation in post-war treaties. The Geneva Convention of 1949 included specific language prohibiting the use of food deprivation as a method of military or civilian conditioning, directly inspired by the discovery of the Kommissbrot program. Medical research on the effects of nutrition on human behavior was revolutionized by the data collected during and after the war. American and British universities established research programs dedicated to understanding the connection between food and aggression, leading to significant advances in understanding the neurology of violent behavior. The program also influenced the development of counterinsurgency strategies during the Cold War. American and Soviet militaries extensively studied Nazi methods, not to replicate them, but to develop defenses against similar techniques that could be used by future adversaries. The most important lesson was the understanding that modern warfare was not limited to conventional armaments and tactics. It included the systematic manipulation of human biology and psychology through seemingly benign means, such as food. During the 1950s and 1960s, Allied veterans who had witnessed the effects of Kommissbrot began to speak publicly about their experiences, contributing to a broader understanding of Nazi methods of social control. Their memoirs revealed details that had not been included in official military reports, painting an even more disturbing picture of the program's extent. Sergeant James Morrison, now retired, wrote in his 1963 memoirs, "What haunts me most is not the violence I saw, but the realization that those German soldiers were victims as much as perpetrators. They had been systematically dehumanized by their own government, turned into weapons through hunger." When you understand that, the entire war takes on a different meaning. Sociological studies of the period revealed that German communities that had been exposed to Kommissbrot for prolonged periods continued to show elevated rates of social problems decades after the war. Divorce rates, domestic violence, and antisocial behavior remained significantly above the German national average, suggesting that the effects of food conditioning persisted much longer than researchers initially predicted. Rehabilitation programs were established in West Germany specifically to deal with the long-term effects of Nazi conditioning. These programs combined nutritional therapy with psychological counseling, attempting to reverse decades of conditioning through the restoration of normal eating patterns and psychological processing of trauma. The influence of the Kommissbrot program extended beyond Germany, inspiring research in other countries on the connection between food and social behavior. Governments around the world began to examine their own food policies through a new lens, recognizing the potential for social manipulation through nutrition. In the Soviet Union, declassified documents decades later revealed that Stalin had ordered detailed studies of Nazi methods of food conditioning, with the goal of developing similar techniques for use in gulags and dissident populations. Although there is no evidence of large-scale implementation, Soviet research on nutritional deprivation as a tool of control continued throughout the Cold War. The United States established classified research programs to study the effects of nutrition on military behavior, seeking to develop rations that could improve combat performance without the negative effects of the Nazi model. These programs eventually led to the development of modern military rations that are carefully balanced to optimize both nutrition and the psychological state of soldiers. The discovery also influenced international food aid policies. Humanitarian organizations developed rigorous protocols to ensure that food aid could not be used as a tool of political control, recognizing that food could be weaponized in subtle but powerful ways. Modern neuroscience research has confirmed many of the observations made about the effects of Kommissbrot during the war. Studies on the connection between nutrition and neurotransmitters revealed that specific deficiencies can indeed alter brain chemistry in ways that increase aggression and reduce empathy. Dr. Michael Chen, a neuroscientist at Stanford University, published a study in 2018 that analyzed preserved Kommissbrot samples using modern techniques. His research confirmed that the substance contained compounds that specifically interfered with serotonin production, the neurotransmitter associated with well-being and impulse control. The Nazis had discovered, through trial and error, a way to create controlled serotonin deficiency, explained Dr. Chen. They essentially turned their soldiers into individuals with chronic aggressive depression. The research also revealed that the chemical additives found in Kommissbrot were precursors to compounds that increased cortisol and adrenaline production, creating a state of chronic stress that kept soldiers in a permanent fight-or-flight mode. This discovery explained why German soldiers fed the substance showed extraordinary resistance to fatigue during combat, but also an increased propensity for extreme violence. Genetic studies of descendants of German soldiers confirmed that food conditioning had created epigenetic changes that were transmitted to subsequent generations, validating post-war observations about persistent behavioral problems in German families. The story of Kommissbrot serves as a somber reminder of how authoritarian regimes can exploit basic human needs for purposes of control and manipulation. The Nazi food conditioning program represents one of the most insidious forms of dehumanization ever documented, the systematic transformation of human beings into instruments of violence through the manipulation of their most fundamental biological needs. What makes this story particularly disturbing is its effectiveness. The Nazis discovered that they could fundamentally alter human behavior without resorting to direct violence or extensive ideological indoctrination. Simply by controlling what people ate, they could create more aggressive soldiers, more submissive populations, and entire societies conditioned to accept violence as the norm. The lessons learned from the Kommissbrot program remain relevant today, in an era where food security and nutrition are recognized as fundamental human rights. The story serves as a warning about the dangers of allowing governments to control basic aspects of human survival, and about the need for constant vigilance to protect individual autonomy against subtle forms of manipulation. More importantly, the story of German black bread reveals how modern warfare transcends traditional battlefields, extending into the most intimate aspects of human experience, including the basic act of eating to survive.